So what I've got going on here is a Palisade study. We're looking at the effects of Palisade. Myself and Kurt Steinke. And my name is Mike Swash. I'm from North Branch, Michigan, from a small farming town over there. And before I get started too, I'd also like to thank the Michigan Wheat Program. This wouldn't be possible without their funding, so really have gratitude for those guys. And for those of you who don't know, Palisade is a plant growth regulator. And it is a gibberellic acid inhibitor. Now what gibberellic acid does is promote cell elongation. So if you reduce the amount of gibberellic acid being produced, you get shorter cells. It's actually pretty simple. So over here, we have no nitrogen applied whatsoever to strictly judge the effect of Palisade. And our first plot, no nitrogen, no Palisade. Pretty yellow, pretty small, basically what you'd expect. Then over here, we have no nitrogen with Palisade. Now what you see is a shorter plant, but also a greener plant. And the reason for that is because you have the same amount of chlorophyll in a smaller space. So your chlorophyll is more dense, you get a greener plant. Now down here, we have 105 pounds of nitrogen, because I don't think probably many of you are applying no nitrogen at all. 105 pounds with Palisade and without Palisade. And again, you see a pretty dramatic height difference here. About 4 or 5 inches on average this year. Now what is the point of that? Why do you want a shorter plant? If any of you have ever dealt with lodging before, you know it can not only be a pain to harvest, but it can actually reduce your yield as well. And the reason for that is when you get that stalk bent down at the base, or anywhere for that matter, it's like kinking a hose a little bit. When you kink that hose off, all your nutrients coming up from the root are not able to reach the grain head. So you can get smaller grain heads, you can get less protein, and ultimately you get less yield. So Palisade last year, we saw about a 4 bushel increase on average across 75, 105, and 135 pounds of N. And the other N rates are down here. Feel free to look at them. If you want to snap off a plant, feel the stalk strength, pull ahead, feel free in this end 1.5 feet. That'll be cut off before harvest to avoid edge effect. And so that 4 bushel, at today's price, about 20 bucks an acre, you could see. And that's about what Palisade is going to run you. So last year we also didn't have big lodging issues in my study. Now this year we may or may not see lodging. Obviously right now no lodging in any of these plots, which is great. But it's early. It could still come. And that's where I see Palisade really coming into play. If you have a taller variety, if you're at the higher nitrogen rates, and your wheat is prone to get tall and lodge, that's where Palisade could be a useful tool. Keep it a little shorter, closer to the ground, lower the center of gravity, and maybe save it from falling over before harvest. And at your lower end rates, you've got a 75 pound rate down here. Again, feel free to look at it, break one off. 75 pounds with a shorter cultivar, you may not need any Palisade. It may just be an extra cost for you. Now, 135 pounds is getting towards the upper limit of what we'd recommend. That's where it may be the most beneficial and the most economic return for your dollar. Now this is red dragon wheat at 1.8 million seeds to the acre. It was planted September 29th. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. You can compare where your wheat may or may not be at. If your wheat is taller, shorter, more or less nitrogen, that's all going to come into effect with this Palisade. There's been studies before about Palisade timing, etc. It doesn't really seem to make a big difference as long as you get it on in that Feeks 5 to 7 window. You can do a split app, a single app. Regardless, usually you get this shortening, this greening of the plant, may or may not see a yield increase. Again, that has to do strictly with your lodging potential. You probably won't see a huge yield bump if your wheat doesn't lodge. So if anybody has any questions, or like I said, if you want to come up, touch it, grab it, break one off, that's fine. Look at the head size, look at the row density. I know wheat can really fool you with yield. It's pretty hard to gauge. It's harder than a corn plant or a soybean plant, I think, to just look at it and say, oh, that's X bushel wheat right there. So feel free, get up close and personal with it, and I'll take any questions that anybody has.
What's the rotation on these fields?
This was soybean last year, and corn before that. So we try to do what the average grower would probably do, come after soybean or maybe a dry bean or something like that. But And soybean does come into play. If you're following a different crop, you may need a little bit more nitrogen. I think a lot of guys already do that, but that's something to keep in mind as well.
Any effect on the maturity
The maturity of soybean? Of the wheat? Oh, okay, well, maturity group of soybean does have an effect on planting date, obviously, so we're looking at that as well. But the maturity of the wheat, what we've seen with the Palisade, it may be a day or two behind as far as flowering and stuff like that. Haven't seen big effects. Palisade was actually initially created for the turf market to reduce seed heads or suppress them and put on more root growth, make a greener, shorter plant. Because on a golf course, if you can mow and water less, that's great. Now, I haven't seen much seed head suppression in the wheat, and if you look real close, especially in your lower end rates, the grain heads actually look fuller to me on those plots that did get the Palisade. Now, whether or not that translates into much yield, we don't know yet. The check may catch up. But right now, I think the grain head is fuller and perhaps a little bit taller as well. So that all comes into play. It's your head count, your grain size, your head size, etc. And that's why yield can be hard to predict with wheat.
What's the timing rate or timing when you put it on proper?
Good question. Palisade was applied at 12 ounces to the acre at Feeks 5.
Is it applied by itself, or can you mix it with?
Well, you got to check the labels of your different fungicides and whatnot for that, but usually you can tank mix, I believe. So if you're going in at Feeks 5 already with nitrogen or maybe a herbicide, yeah, usually I think it's safe to tank mix. But I can't say for certain that you can tank mix with anything.